especially when I start working with those newer individuals who are new to the marathon and just start as fast. I think that lesson of consistency is just really important. The big thing that I've learned with a lot of them, like anytime we start something new, we kind of want to go 0 to 100 and go all in. But the marathon or distance like ultras or anything in general, it's a long-term game. And if you go out 0 to 100 too quick, like we kind of said, that's definitely a big risk factor for injuries, but also just psychologically over time that will take a lot out of you.
So we talked about your top two recommendations for someone in the 4 to 5 hour marathon range. I'm curious your take on how does someone who is faster than that continue to improve? If you're a 2:30, 2:45 marathoner and, a minute is a huge amount of time to take off. How does somebody think about progress at the high end? Or let's say you're running a 100 miler and you've been doing it at 16 hours, but you want to do it in 15 hours. Like, how do you think about that?
It's a great question. And I think some of the stuff David's been doing recently is a really good example of this, where when you have a really high training age, which if you're running a marathon in 2.5 hours, you definitely are, or you're running an ultra at that time, you have a high training age. That's where the run training obviously is critical. And you want to make sure you're experimenting with new types of training, and you need a new stimulus over time, a progressive stimulus that you haven't been exposed to. But as I've worked with higher and higher level marathoners, like the sub 230 males and the sub 245 females who I've been working with, I've really noticed that just in running in general, there's a large focus on the running aspect, which is really important, but a lot of overlooking at some of these other aspects that are critical to make sure you can adapt to the training, recover, and get better. Because if you want to get better at that point in your career when you're running that fast already, you need to be running a certain amount of mileage per week theoretically and at certain intensities. And so you need to recover from those high intensities and that high volume. And for me, it comes down to a lot of them just weren't paying a lot of attention to nutrition. Most of them were under eating, to be honest, relative to their training volumes. Most of them weren't sleeping well, didn't really care about any kind of supplementation, like never had blood work done before, which you and I could talk about, given the Insight Tracker. So I remember I was talking to this 214 marathoner, I won't say his name here, in New York, who was stagnant for like 5 years. And I was like asking about his diet, nutrition. I realized he hadn't had meat in 4 years and wasn't taking any kind of supplementation. He got blood work done. His iron levels were nothing, right? So like ferritin, all that, where it's like, okay, like if you have no underlying iron, like you're not going to adapt to this training anymore. So he ended up getting a ferritin iron that figured out through blood work and started adapting really well to training again. But it's just an example of when you get to that level of training, there's these other factors that you really need to think about. And I would say the biggest ones I've looked into with these higher level athletes running this volume now is definitely the nutrition, making sure they're eating enough throughout the day, making sure they're eating enough carbs around before their sessions, in their sessions, and after the sessions, because most of them are running twice a day or they're running every day high volumes where the carbs are critical to fuel the intensity of that training, which is going to lead to better adaptation, but also making sure you recover from that session so you can run again the next day. So the nutrition, and then just the other stuff outside of it, like the sleep, like encouraging them to get better sleep at night. That's going to help them recover so they can run more. Thinking about supplementation too, like some of the bicarb stuff to support some of their training, like gel supplementation, carbohydrate supplementation to support the training. So I think for those who are getting at the point where you're running marathons that fast, ultras that fast, I would really encourage you to look at, training's critical, but understand all the other factors in your life that really contribute to how you respond to the training. And for me, the biggest ones in that area are nutrition, sleep, recovery, and supplementation.
I love that that's where you went with it, because it's the point that I love to hammer home on, that it's like you can do all the work, but if you can't recover from it, the work is kind of pointless. One of the changes I've made recently as my workouts have gotten longer is fueling in a workout, let alone a long run. And so my workouts have gotten between 80 to 90 minutes. And previously, it's like 75, which is kind of borderline. And so this workout I did on Tuesday, I took shameless plug for Fuel Goods. Fuel Goods sent me all these beautiful carbs. And so I took a precision gel and I had a serving of the Scratch hydration. So that's about 50 grams of carbs that I had within like a 20-minute spread, but somewhere in the middle of that. So yeah, 50 grams of carbs is not a lot for a 90-minute effort. What would your guidance be in regards to carb and fuel consumption during workouts? Because people, are familiar with the concept of fueling during long runs, but at what
Yeah.
point in your week of running should you start thinking about intra fueling?
It's a really good question, and I think there's some contextual things to point out here. Number one, it's definitely a big factor is going to be how much volume you accumulate in a week. Where, yeah, we typically think, and from the science or what a lot of the researchers recommend now, if anything's less than 90 minutes, you probably have enough stored carbohydrates to theoretically handle that. If you add intensity in there, so if you have a 90-minute workout, for example, but there's high intensity in there, you're doing threshold work, VO2 max work, I always typically add some carbs in. My number one rule is if it's ever a session over 90 minutes, we typically look for at least 45 grams an hour, but probably closer to 60 grams an hour. If it's a 90-minute session, that's like a key session with a lot of intensity, we typically do have the athletes I work with take 60 grams of carbs an hour at least, sometimes closer to 90. Number one, to help fuel this session. And number two, because it also just helps them practice fueling, training your stomach to handle that fueling, to handle the stress of eating while you're running is really important so that on race day, you have less stomach stress. You get better at using those carbs. And then the last point I think is really important too is kind of like I said at the beginning is it really depends on how much volume you're accumulating in a week. So if you're an athlete who's running 100 miles a week or more, or like even 70 or 80, there's a good chance you're running at a decent clip the next day or sometimes later that day. And what I like to tell the athletes too, okay, the carbs you take during this like 80-minute run or the 90-minute AM session, it might not directly improve your performance in that AM session. A lot of times I think it does just from having the extra carbs. But what we definitely know from the research is it's going to help you recover faster. You're probably going to accumulate less muscle damage. You're probably going to bounce back quicker. You're just going to feel better. So if you recover faster from that session by fueling in the session, your run later that day or your run the next day is going to be a much better quality or a much better stimulus for you because you're more recovered. And that's going to hold true throughout the week. You're going to recover better throughout the week from fueling those runs and run fueling, anything closer to like that 90-minute mark. So then you can just accumulate better quality training volume throughout a week, which we know does lead to better performance. So like anything like less than 60 minutes, I typically don't do any fasted runs, but I'm not a big fan of it. But anything like less than like 45 or 60 minutes, that's an easy run. I tend not to worry too much. But once we cross that hour mark, we get closer to 90 minutes, even if it's an easy run. And especially if you're doing like threshold work in there or there's any kind of intervals in there, I always recommend at least like 45 grams of carbs per hour and working up to like maybe 60. Once you go closer to those really long runs, we get closer to 90. And again, not only to support that training session, but to support the next training session, even if it's not a long run.